Peculiar, isn't it? How we construct these elaborate theaters of the mind where we're perpetually center stage, convinced the entire world is watching our every stumble, analyzing our every choice. The truth about human attention, and this may sting a bit, is that they're not thinking about you as much as you think. Not by a considerable margin, I'm afraid. You see, I've spent decades observing people, studying the intricate machinery of human behavior, and there's a delicious irony that runs through our species like a golden thread. We are simultaneously the most self-absorbed creatures on this planet and the most convinced that others are equally absorbed in us. It's rather like believing everyone else is tuned to the same radio station that plays nothing but our personal soundtrack, when in reality they're all listening to their own rather loud and demanding broadcasts. This fascination with being perpetually observed stems from what I call the spotlight fallacy, though psychologists have dressed it up with fancier names. We walk through life as if there's an invisible theater spotlight following us, illuminating our every action for an audience that, frankly, has far better things to do than critique our performance. The spotlight exists, mind you, but it's rather more like a flickering candle, and most of the time, people are too busy managing their own flames to notice yours. But here's where it becomes truly interesting, and where our minds play the most exquisite trick on us. We commit what's known as the appeal to probability fallacy, assuming that because something could happen, it will happen, or worse, that it is happening. Because people could be judging us, we assume they are judging us. Because that embarrassing moment could be remembered forever, we behave as if it will be remembered forever. Our brilliant brains evolved to keep us safe in small tribal communities where everyone indeed knew everyone else's business, haven't quite caught up to the reality of modern life where we're essentially invisible extras in everyone else's main story. I remember sitting in a cafe once watching a young woman at the next table. She'd dropped her fork with a rather spectacular clatter, and the look of mortification that crossed her face was extraordinary, as if she'd committed some cardinal sin against humanity. She glanced around nervously, certain that every patron was now mentally cataloguing this moment for future ridicule. What struck me was that within 30 seconds, every other person in that cafe had returned to their newspapers, their conversations, their own internal dramas. But she sat there for another 10 minutes, practically vibrating with embarrassment over an event that had already been forgotten by everyone except herself. This is the human condition in miniature, isn't it? We're all walking around carrying these tremendous weights of imagined scrutiny, convinced we're the main character in everyone else's story, when the rather liberating truth is that we're barely supporting cast in most people's narratives. They're far too busy being the star of their own production to spend much time analyzing ours. Now, before you think I'm suggesting we're all irrelevant, quite the contrary. We matter enormously, but in ways that are far more meaningful and far less performative than we imagine. The people who truly love us aren't sitting in judgment of our stumbles. They're too busy loving us. And the people whose opinions we fear most, well, they're generally too preoccupied with their own anxieties about what we think of and them, to spare much mental energy for criticism. What I want to explore with you is not just this curious psychological phenomenon, but how understanding it can fundamentally shift the way you move through the world. How recognizing that most people are far too busy managing their own internal chaos to spend time analyzing yours can free you from a prison you've likely been constructing for yourself since childhood. And perhaps most importantly, how this knowledge can transform your relationships, your risk-taking, your creativity, and your capacity for genuine connection. Let me tell you about Margaret, a woman I knew years ago who embodied this struggle in the most poignant way. Margaret was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, with ideas that could have changed her field entirely. but she spent most of her energy crafting elaborate scenarios about how her colleagues would react to her proposals. She'd written entire speeches she'd never give, developed groundbreaking theories she'd never share, because she was convinced that every person in her professional sphere was waiting for her to fail so they could pounce on her inadequacies. The reality, which became clear when I encouraged her to actually test these assumptions, was quite different. Her colleagues were so absorbed in their own research, their own fears of judgment, their own struggles with imposter syndrome, that they barely had time to form opinions about Margaret's work, let alone elaborate plots to undermine it. When she finally did present her ideas, the response wasn't the savage critique she'd imagined, but genuine interest mixed with relief that someone else was taking intellectual risks so they didn't have to. Margaret had fallen victim to what I call the probability trap. She'd taken the mere possibility that people might judge her harshly and, in her mind, had transformed it into a certainty that they would judge her harshly. This is the appeal to probability fallacy in its most destructive form. Because criticism could happen, she behaved as if it was happening, even when it wasn't. I've seen this pattern repeated countless times in countless variations. The aspiring writer who doesn't submit his novel because readers might hate it. The woman who doesn't speak up in meetings because her colleagues might think she's foolish. The man who doesn't ask someone on a date because they might reject him. All of them confusing possibility with probability, probability with certainty, and certainty with current reality. But here's what's truly fascinating about human attention. It's remarkably limited and surprisingly selfish. Not selfish in a malicious way, but selfish in the most natural, survival-oriented way imaginable. Each person you encounter is managing approximately 60,000 thoughts per day, most of which concern their own immediate needs, desires, fears, and plans. They're thinking about their mortgage, their relationship troubles, what to have for dinner, whether they said the wrong thing in that meeting, if their child is happy at school, why their back hurts, and whether they remembered to lock the car. Into this swirling chaos of personal preoccupation, you appear. Perhaps you stumble slightly, or say something awkward, or wear an unusual outfit. For a moment, a brief moment, you might register in their consciousness, but you're competing with 60,000 other thoughts, and unless you've done something truly spectacular, either wonderfully or terribly spectacular, you'll be crowded out by more pressing concerns within minutes, sometimes seconds. This isn't cruelty, it's cognitive efficiency. If we truly paid sustained attention to every person we encountered and everything they did, we'd be paralyzed by information overload. So our brains have evolved to be remarkably good at filtering, at focusing on what seems immediately relevant to our own survival and well-being, and letting everything else fade into background noise. Now, understanding this intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two entirely different animals. The intellectual understanding is relatively simple. People are busy with their own lives and don't spend much time thinking about you. The emotional integration of this truth, the deep cellular acceptance that allows you to move through the world with genuine freedom, that requires practice, patience, and a willingness to test your assumptions against reality. Let me share what I've learned about making this transition from intellectual understanding to emotional freedom. First, start small and start specific. Instead of trying to convince yourself that nobody ever thinks about you, which isn't true and isn't the point, begin by questioning your assumptions about specific situations. When you have that familiar surge of anxiety about being judged, pause and ask yourself, what evidence do I have that this person is actually thinking critically about me right now? Most of the time, you'll discover that your evidence is purely speculative. You're operating on possibilities, not probabilities, and certainly not on confirmed realities. That woman who glanced at you oddly might have been thinking about her grocery list. The colleague who seemed dismissive might have been distracted by a personal problem. The friend who didn't respond to your text immediately might be dealing with any of 1,000 different priorities that have nothing whatsoever to do with you. This leads us to the second principle. Embrace the profound relief of insignificance. I don't mean insignificance in terms of your worth or your impact on the people who matter to you. I mean the beautiful, liberating insignificance of being just another person moving through the world, free from the exhausting burden of constant performance. There's a meditation I often recommend. Spend a day in a crowded place, a shopping center, a busy street, a large cafe, and really observe the flow of human attention. Watch how people's eyes move, where their focus goes, how quickly they shift from one concern to another. Notice how rarely they linger on any individual person, how absorbed they are in their phones, their companions, their own thoughts. This isn't people being rude or disconnected. This is people being human. And the profound realization is that you are exactly the same way. When did you last spend significant time analyzing a stranger's appearance or behavior? When did you last form lasting judgments about someone you barely know? The third principle involves reframing your relationship with attention itself. Instead of fearing negative attention and craving positive attention, both of which keep you trapped in the performance cycle, begin to appreciate the freedom that comes with being genuinely overlooked. Some of my most creative, most authentic, most joyful moments have come when I was completely unconscious of being observed, when I was so absorbed in the activity itself that the potential audience disappeared entirely. This is what psychologists call flow state, but I prefer to think of it as audience amnesia, those blessed moments when you forget that anyone might be watching and simply exist fully in whatever you're doing. These moments are not only more enjoyable, they're typically when we do our best work, make our deepest connections, and access our most authentic selves. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, begin to distinguish between the people whose opinions actually matter and the vast sea of humanity whose opinions, while perfectly valid for their own lives, have no real bearing on yours. This isn't about developing a callous disregard for others, but about developing a healthy sense of discernment about whose feedback deserves your emotional energy. The people whose opinions truly matter are usually quite small in number, those who love you, those who know you well, those whose expertise you respect, and those whose values align with yours. Everyone else, and this may sound harsh, but it's wonderfully liberating, everyone else is essentially offering commentary on a life they don't understand, based on information they don't have, filtered through experiences and biases that have nothing to do with you. I learned this lesson rather dramatically during my early career. I was terrified of criticism, convinced that every review, every comment, every casual remark about my work was a definitive judgment on my worth as a human being. I spent enormous amounts of energy trying to anticipate and prevent negative reactions, crafting my choices based on what I imagined others wanted, rather than what I believed was right. The turning point came when I realized that the critics I feared most were often projecting their own insecurities, their own failed dreams, their own fears about taking risks. Their criticism said far more about them than it did about me. And the praise I craved most desperately often came from people who barely knew me, whose approval was essentially meaningless because it was based on performance rather than authentic connection. This brings us to perhaps the most profound aspect of this whole discussion. When you stop performing for an imaginary audience, you become available for genuine relationship with a real one. The energy you've been spending on managing others' hypothetical opinions can be redirected toward creating authentic connections with people who matter. Real intimacy, whether in friendship, romance, or professional collaboration, requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is impossible when you're convinced everyone is waiting for you to fail. When you truly understand that most people are too busy with their own struggles to spend time judging yours, you can begin to share your actual thoughts, express your real opinions, take meaningful risks, and offer your authentic self to the world. The final piece of practical wisdom I want to offer concerns the appeal to probability fallacy specifically. This cognitive error, treating possibilities as probabilities and probabilities as certainties, extends far beyond social anxiety into every area of life where fear holds us back. Every time you catch yourself thinking, "What if they think?" or "Everyone will probably," or "People always," pause and examine the logical structure of that thought. Are you taking a possibility and treating it as inevitable? Are you applying a general probability to a specific situation where it may not apply? Are you assuming uniformity of opinion in a world where people disagree about everything? Most importantly, are you making decisions based on imaginary futures rather than present realities? The appeal to probability fallacy convinces us to live as if our worst-case scenarios are already happening, which is not only exhausting but also prevents us from taking the very actions that might lead to our best-case scenarios. Here's what I wish someone had told me decades ago: the people who matter don't mind, and the people who mind don't matter. It's an old saying, but it contains profound truth. Those who love you, those who truly see you, those whose opinions carry real weight in your life, they're not sitting in judgment of your stumbles or waiting for you to be perfect. They're hoping you'll be brave enough to be real, vulnerable enough to be known, and confident enough to stop performing and start living. And those who do sit in judgment, those who are quick to criticize, eager to find fault, ready to pounce on any perceived weakness, they're usually revealing far more about their own pain, their own insecurity, their own fear of being judged, than they are about any real flaws in you. Their criticism is often a projection of their internal experience onto your external behavior. As we conclude this exploration into the beautiful irrelevance of others' opinions, I want to leave you with a challenge and a promise. The challenge is this: for the next week, act as if you truly believed that people are far too busy with their own lives to spend much time analyzing yours. Make that phone call you've been avoiding. Wear that outfit you love but think might be too much. Express that opinion you've been keeping to yourself. Take that small risk you've been postponing. The promise is that when you begin to live from this understanding, when you truly internalize that you're not the main character in everyone else's story, you'll discover a freedom you perhaps haven't felt since childhood, a freedom to be curious instead of careful, authentic instead of strategic, creative instead of cautious. You'll find that the spotlight you've been so afraid of was largely a creation of your own mind, and that stepping out of its imaginary glare doesn't leave you in darkness. It leaves you in the warm, natural light of genuine human connection, where people are too busy being real with each other to waste time on judgment and performance. The theater of the mind, where you've been the star performer in everyone else's critical review, can finally close its curtains. The real world, where people are generally kind, usually distracted, and almost always more concerned with their own dramas than yours, is waiting for your authentic presence. Stop performing for an audience that isn't watching. Start living for the people who are.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.